You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.
You can now access the latest in medical news on your Amazon Alexa-enabled device. Join me, Perry Wilson, every weekday morning for Medscape Medical Minute, where I highlight the top medical stories of the day. To add Medscape Medical Minute to your flash briefing, search for Medscape Medical Minute on Amazon and click Enable. Or open the Amazon Alexa app, go to Skills, search for Medscape Medical Minute, and click Enable. Then say, Alexa, what's the news? Or, Alexa, what's my flash briefing? I hope you'll join us.
Hi, everyone. This is John Mandrola from theheart.org Medscape Cardiology, and this is This Week in Cardiology for December 3rd, 2021. This week, the Amaze Trial, non-statin oral lipid-lowering drugs, EHR Alerts, non-physician care, and obesity. First up is the Amaze Trial and left atrial appendage ligation. On the surface, there is the mundane issue of whether doing more destruction in the left atrium improves ablation outcomes. Now, in patients with persistent or long-standing persistent AFib, the Amaze trial tested whether add-on left atrial appendage ligation with the Lariat device would reduce AF compared with standard AF ablation alone, which was PVI. The answer was no. There was no statistical reduction of AF with more extensive work in the left atrium. But Amaze teaches us many other lessons relevant to, say, regulatory approval, critical appraisal, and the value of a medically conservative approach to procedures. Now, first, some specifics on the Amaze trial. This was 610 patients randomized with advanced forms of AFib. The treatment arm had Lariat left atrial appendage occlusion first, then PV isolation 1 to 2 months later. The control arm was basic pulmonary vein isolation. Now, Lariat is a device approved via the very lax FDA 510 clearance for the approximation of soft tissue, like it was some sort of suture device. Now, of course, it is not just a suture device. It is basically an epicardial clip for the left atrial appendage. The idea being that if you clip the left atrial appendage, you electrically and mechanically isolate it, and this would reduce AFib. 64% of the control arm had freedom from AFib versus 60% of the Lariat arm. The difference did not get close to statistical significance. Now, there were some attempts to look at subgroups, but this is dubious. When there is a strongly non-significant primary endpoint, ignore those subgroup differences. Now, in addition to no efficacy, the Lariat group had 12 patients suffer serious complications, 3 of which required surgical intervention. The authors say in their presentation that the primary safety endpoint was met at 3.4%, but they set the safety endpoint at less than 10%. Now, what we will need to see is the actual events in the 2 groups when the paper is published. Now, we can tell from the slides without the paper that this technology as an add-on to AF ablation is not effective and not especially safe either. But I mentioned there were other important lessons, and the first is regulatory. The Lariat is a highly specific device used to do epicardial left atrial appendage closure or occlusion. That's extremely invasive, and it ought to be proven effective and safe for some things, say, like stroke prevention or AFib prevention, before being unleashed on the public. Well, it clearly wasn't adequately tested. The FDA 510K clearance does not require clinical testing for this specific indication. Rather, clearance is predicated on a demonstration of, quote, substantial equivalence with existing devices used for suture placement. Now, approving this device for the approximation of soft tissues exposes a huge loophole in regulatory function of the FDA. And I'm not sure Amaze would have been done if not for the July 15th JAMA Internal Medicine paper, which chronicled a worrisome incidence of major complications in the MAUDE database from this Lariat device. The Amaze trial was posted to clinicaltrials.gov 1 month after the publication of that paper in 2015. There is, of course, another lesson relevant to the medically conservative approach to invasive new techniques like this left atrial appendage isolation. Also, in 2015, a group of prominent electrophysiologists presented a trial called the BELIEF trial. BELIEF found that there was a significant reduction in atrial fibrillation with electrical isolation of the left atrial appendage. At the time, I wrote a strong critical appraisal of that trial, and the president of European Heart Rhythm Association criticized it heavily at its presentation. And one of the main issues is that when you electrically isolate the appendage, it does not squeeze, and it becomes this huge nidus for clots and a major stroke risk. You create near total anticoagulation dependence, and some have even advocated for placing Watchman-like devices to plug it when and after the left atrial appendage is isolated. Now, in the intervening 6 years, until the Amaze trial at this year's AHA, there have been no further RCTs confirming this technique. There are observational studies and some meta-analysis of observational studies plus the BELIEF trial. But now Amaze comes out with nearly 4 times more patients than the BELIEF trial, and it finds that the left atrial appendage ligation has no effect. It's not exactly the same technique of left atrial appendage isolation, but it's close. So the value of Amaze is that it teaches us the important lesson that before accepting a new technique or therapy, especially one that has serious trade-offs, we should have more than one trial. If you want to do more to people, more invasive procedures, then the onus is on the proponents to show us that it definitively works. Second topic is a new CTAP inhibitor. Now, the number one trending story amongst cardiologists on the heart.org Medscape Cardiology website this week is coverage of obicetrapib, a new lipid-lowering agent in a class that had been written off, the cholesterol ester transfer protein inhibitor class, known as CTAPs, known mostly for its ability to raise HDL, has been mainly abandoned because of inefficacy of outcomes and also off-target effects. Journalist Sue Hughes has a superb story that recounts that obicetrapib, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, was destined for the trash heap, as Amgen, the makers of it, decided to discontinue its development in 2017. But a group of academics believed in the drug, and they set up a new company that acquired the rights to the drug. Now, what we know from the presentation at AHA is pretty preclinical and rudimentary. We know that the drug, obicetrapib, is a more potent LDL reducer compared with others in its class, and it does not have the torcetrapib-like side effects such as an increase in blood pressure, decrease in potassium, and worsening CV outcomes. The study presented at AHA was called the ROSE study, and it included 120 patients who had been on high-intensity statins. The primary endpoint was a change in LDL, so not clinical outcomes. And obicetrapib showed a 51% reduction in LDL with a 10 milligram dose, a 42% reduction with 5 milligram dose. ApoB also went down 30%, and lipoprotein a down 56%, and HDL went up 165%. So these are big movements of lipid particles. And of course, this is an oral pill. Right now, there's a race to find an oral replacement for the PCSK9 inhibitor drugs. Well, obviously, the next steps for obicetrapib is to show reduction of clinical outcomes and safety. That's the hard part, because remember, high-intensity statins drive event rates quite low, so it's hard to make a low event rate even lower. Now, speaking of an oral PCSK9 inhibitor, journalist Steve Stiles has coverage of a phase 1 trial of a Merck drug. It doesn't even have a name yet. It's just MK0616. And this is an oral PCSK9 inhibitor that lowers LDL cholesterol on top of statins. And the drug was generally well tolerated up to and including single doses of 300 milligrams. And that was the maximum tested in these studies. This compound is a cyclic peptide that is, quote, about 1/100th the size of a monoclonal antibody. But they were able to achieve monoclonal antibody-like potency and selectivity with much smaller footprints molecularly. Now, phase 1 studies, this was a phase 1 study presented at AHA, is done to evaluate the safety of a new drug in candidates before it proceeds to further studies. It's a long road from phase 1 to success in phase 3 clinical trials. But of course, you have to run 10 kilometers before you can finish a marathon. So success early means you can move on to phase 2, which are generally dosing trials. The point here, I think, is that there's a race to get to an oral add-on drug that's as potent as PCSK9 inhibitors. Now, next topic, EHR Alerts on Prognosis. I've said on this podcast that heart failure care can be heartless. Everyone gets focused on getting patients on meds, clicking the boxes, and sometimes comorbidities and quality of life and symptom relief falls to the wayside. Now, and also, due to heart failure's broad presentation and these frequent comorbid conditions, there can be overtreatment at the expense of palliation, but there can also be undertreatment of things like rhythm issues, say left bundle branch block or AFib with a rapid rate. The question that researchers at Yale asked was, what if we gave clinicians electronic health record alerts, EHR alerts, about their patient's prognosis? Would this knowledge lead to better treatment decisions and then better outcomes? The way they answered the question was the best possible way, with a randomized controlled trial. Patients with heart failure who were hospitalized, they were randomized to an alert on the 1-year prognosis when clinicians entered orders or to usual care. Now, this score came from a prediction score, and it was an amalgam of clinical risk factors. This group has described the discrimination and calibration of this score in their rationale paper. The calibration observed versus predicted risk was a little bit lower in the trial population, and the authors speculate that this was due to excess mortality during the pandemic. This was a big trial, about 1,500 patients in each arm, and the results were clear. There was no difference in composite clinical outcomes, 1-year mortality, or 30-day readmissions. There was also no difference in guideline-directed medical therapy use, palliative care referrals. I highlight this study because we learned from it. We learned that mortality estimates during standard workflow did not change treatment or outcomes. Whether this is due to alert fatigue or the fact that care was already pretty darn good, or that clinicians intrinsically take into account the prognosis without any quantification, matters less than the simple fact that it didn't work. So we learned that a specific message that this sort of EHR alert doesn't work. But the larger message is that pragmatic system-level policy things can be studied. Imagine if every EHR alert was studied like this. We'd probably see fewer alerts, and that might mean that the ones that we do see had an effect. All right, next topic is non-physician care, NonMD care. I love new clinical care models. Listeners of this podcast know that one of my favorite studies of all time was the late Ron Victor's Black Barbershop study. Well, at AHA, we learned a group at Mass General and Brigham presented a really nice paper on a digital care transformation in the management of hypertension and lipids. It's a new model not only because it involves digitally recruiting and digitally measuring and transmitting blood pressures, but also because it puts non-physicians as primary caregivers. Before I tell you about how this system works and what this group achieved, I should set out that there are vast swaths of Americans who have poor control of cardiovascular risk factors like blood pressure and cholesterol. So just asking more people to run the gauntlet of traditional care models, to come to a physician's office, do the check-in, do the insurance paperwork, and interact with an ever-decreasing supply of increasingly distracted doctors isn't going to work. What's more, it's often people with fewer resources who live in rural and urban settings that have the most to gain from better blood pressure and lipid control. Sadly, though, the most needed areas often have the least supply of clinicians. So what this group at Harvard did was, one, they identified from the electronic health record patients that were not at goal, and they provided them with a digitally connected blood pressure devices. And here are the really cool parts. The group then put non-licensed patient navigators, aka regular people, as primary contacts with patients. These regular people provided education and gathered data. Then pharmacists had the power to independently prescribe and titrate medications and do labs according to guidelines. Physicians functioned in a consultative role as needed. Now, the glue that held this model together is a remote care delivery program. They have reported the results of the first 5,000 patients previously as a research letter in circulation. At AHA, they reported the results of the first 10,000 patients. The raw data in this model is pretty staggering. For 10,000 patients, they made 100,000 phone calls and recorded more than 400,000 blood pressure values. And the results ended up being significant. in patients who completed the program, there were big drops in systolic blood pressure and LDL cholesterol. And for LDL, the average of enrolled patients was a 45 milligram per deciliter drop, which is huge because this includes all patients, not just the ones who completed the program. They also noted equivalent degrees of LDL reduction in Black, Hispanic, and non-English speaking groups. Now, here are the key summary points. First of all, this was remote. It was algorithm-driven, pharmacist-led, and it was a program using regular people as navigators, and it produced impressive reductions in blood pressure and LDL, and it did so in groups of patients who have traditionally had less access to care. I present this work on the podcast because I see it as the future. The role of physicians will change, and that we transition to more supervisory roles. Now, I know there'll be naysayers of this model. They'll point to the fact that 24,000 patients were screened, 18,000 were contacted, and 10,000 were enrolled, and less than half of those were maintained in the program. They will also say that a place as endowed with dollars and motivated people like Harvard can pull this off, but let's see it work in places like Detroit or Los Angeles or rural West Virginia. Another critique will be one that may come out in the paper will surround the question of harm. Were there complications of more aggressive blood pressure control, for instance? Remember, blood pressure and LDL are surrogate markers. What we care about is stroke, heart attacks, and mortality. Ideally, I could see this sort of model being tested in cluster randomized trials. And I understand the criticism, but I see this kind of study as a proof of concept effort. We need better ways to deliver the same guideline-directed care that wealthy, insured Americans can get to all people. The young Dr. Alexander Blood is the first author. He did an excellent presentation. I say congratulations to the group, and I look forward to reading the paper. The final topic today is obesity. Obesity in the young. JAMA published a short research letter that delivered shocking results regarding the health of young adults aged 18 to 25. Now recall, my friends, that this age group is the pinnacle of one's physical health. My eye doctor taught me that lesson. One time in my late 20s, he said, "There's been a change in your prescription." And I replied with foolish optimism. I said, "It's gotten better." He pushed that refraction gadget aside and he said something that is burned into my brain. He says, "No, John, you are past your peak. Everything now is downhill." He was speaking about my eyes. But the point remains that age 18 to 25 are our best years physically. The JAMA paper, from researchers that use the longitudinal database, the NHANES database, they reported on trends in obesity prevalence in this young adult age group. Their outcome of interest was the BMI. I know the BMI is imperfect, but it was just as imperfect 30 years ago. The research team formed 4 groups: underweight, normal, overweight, and obese, defined by a BMI greater than 30. The prevalence of normal weight plummeted to 37.5%. The rate of obesity sharply increased to 33%. The first author, Dr. Alejandro Ellison Barnes, said in the news report, quote, "While we were not surprised by the general trend, given what is known about the increasing prevalence of obesity in both children and adults, we were surprised by the magnitude of the increase in prevalence and that the average BMI in this age group now falls in the overweight range." The average 18 to 25-year-old in America is now overweight. In 1980, the percent of 18 to 25-year-olds who were obese was 6%. Now it is nearly 1 in 3. This was a very short research letter. The authors write this utterly underassuming sentence in the discussion, quote, "Emerging adulthood may be a key period for preventing and treating obesity, given that habits formed during this period often persist through the remainder of life." Now look, of course, I obviously don't have the answer to rising rates of obesity, but the fact that this many adults in the prime of their life are obese, 1 in 3, this seems like a public health crisis. It will surely lead to higher rates of diabetes and the complications of diabetes and higher rates of stroke and heart attack, and, of course, worse bone and joint outcomes. So I'm glad that JAMA published this data. It's sobering, but it's important. Obviously, public health is most focused at the moment on a communicable disease, but my gosh, the problem of obesity in the young also seems worthy of serious attention and efforts. So that's it for this week in cardiology. As always, I'm grateful that you listened. Thank you. And remember, friends, if you like this podcast, please take the time to give us a rating. Write us even a 1 or 2 sentence review. These sorts of little things go a long way to helping others find us. Until next week, this is John Mandrola from the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from the Heart.org on Medscape.